The story of Kabbalah begins not with a single revelation or a dramatic moment of founding, but with whispers that echoed through ancient temples and study halls, with questions that troubled the minds of sages who gazed at scripture and wondered what depths lay beneath the surface of the words. Long before the medieval masters would construct elaborate systems of divine emanations and cosmic repair, before the Zohar would illuminate the Spanish landscape with its mythic radiance, there existed a current of mystical inquiry within the Jewish tradition that sought to penetrate the mysteries of creation, to understand the nature of the divine presence, and to glimpse the hidden architecture of reality itself. These early seekers were not satisfied with the plain meaning of texts or the straightforward observance of commandments. They sensed that behind the veil of ordinary religious life there existed deeper chambers of understanding, and they were determined to find the keys that would unlock those chambers. The biblical world itself provided hints of this mystical dimension. The prophets spoke of visions that transcended ordinary perception, experiences that lifted them beyond the mundane world into realms of fire and spirit. Ezekiel stood by the river Chebar and saw the heavens open, revealing a throne of sapphire and wheels within wheels, creatures with 4 faces and wings that touched one another, and above it all a figure with the appearance of a human form, surrounded by radiance like a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. Isaiah beheld the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, with seraphim calling to one another about the holiness that filled the earth. These were not mere poetic descriptions, but testimonies to encounters with dimensions of reality that lay beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness. The early mystics understood that these prophetic experiences pointed toward a structure of divine reality that could potentially be explored, mapped, and perhaps even accessed by those who possessed the proper knowledge and preparation. In the period following the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, when Jewish life underwent a fundamental transformation from a religion centered on sacrifice and priesthood to one organized around study and prayer, certain circles of scholars began to cultivate what would later be called merkavah mysticism, the mysticism of the chariot. The term derived from Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot throne, and the practitioners of this mystical discipline sought to replicate the prophet's experience through intense meditation, fasting, and the recitation of hymns and prayers. These merkavah mystics were not fringe figures operating outside the rabbinic mainstream. Many were respected scholars, men deeply learned in Torah and tradition, who nevertheless felt called to pursue a more immediate experience of the divine presence than textual study alone could provide. The literature that emerged from these circles reveals a landscape of heavenly palaces, angelic hierarchies, and dangerous passages through celestial realms. The practitioner of merkavah mysticism would prepare through ritual purification and fasting, then enter a trance state in which the soul would ascend through 7 heavens, each guarded by fierce angelic gatekeepers who demanded passwords and seals before permitting passage. The journey was perilous, fraught with the possibility of madness or death for those who attempted it without proper preparation or merit. The texts warned of 4 who entered the Pardes, the mystical orchard or paradise. 1 died, 1 went mad, 1 became a heretic, and only Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and departed in peace. This cautionary tale became a touchstone for all subsequent Jewish mysticism, a reminder that the pursuit of hidden knowledge carried profound risks as well as potential rewards. The hymns and prayers of the merkavah mystics, preserved in texts like the Hekkalot literature, are strange and powerful compositions, filled with repetitive strings of divine names, descriptions of angelic beings with bodies of fire and lightning, and accounts of the divine glory that sits enthroned above the highest heaven. These were not meant to be read as literature, but to be used as technology, as tools for inducing altered states of consciousness and facilitating the ascent of the soul. The names of God were understood not as arbitrary labels but as concentrations of divine power that, when pronounced correctly and in the proper state of purity, could open gates between worlds and compel even the highest angels to reveal their secrets. This understanding of language as more than communication, as a force that shapes and structures reality itself, would become one of the foundational principles of all later Kabbalistic thought. Sometime between the 3rd and 6th centuries, a remarkable text appeared that would profoundly influence the development of Jewish mysticism. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation or Book of Formation, presented a cosmological and cosmogonic system based on the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and 10 primordial numbers called sefirot. Unlike the ecstatic and visionary literature of the merkavah mystics, the Sefer Yetzirah offered what appeared to be a more philosophical or even scientific account of how the universe came into being. The text described how God created the world through 32 paths of wisdom, consisting of 22 letters and 10 sefirot, which are described variously as numbers, qualities, and dimensions. The letters are divided into 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 simples, corresponding to elements, planets, and zodiacal signs. Through combinations and permutations of these letters, all of creation came into existence. The Sefer Yetzirah is a brief, cryptic text, more a series of enigmatic statements than a systematic exposition. Its obscurity guaranteed that it would require interpretation, and generations of commentators would offer radically different readings of its meaning. Some understood it as a guide to practical magic, instructions for creating a golem or artificial man through the manipulation of letters and divine names. Others read it as a philosophical treatise on the structure of language and reality. Still others saw it as a meditative manual, a guide to contemplating the foundations of existence. What made the text so influential was not any single interpretation, but its core claim that letters and numbers were not merely human conventions, but the very building blocks of reality, that language was not a tool we use to describe the world, but the medium through which the world itself was formed. The concept of sefirot in the Sefer Yetzirah would undergo dramatic development in later Kabbalah, but even in this early form, it introduced a crucial idea, that there are intermediary stages or instruments between the infinite divine source and the finite material world. The sefirot are described as having no end, stretching in multiple directions, and their beginning and end are joined together. They seem to represent both attributes of God and dimensions or aspects of creation, occupying an ambiguous space that is neither purely divine nor purely creaturely. This ambiguity, this positioning of certain realities at the threshold between the infinite and the finite, would become central to how Kabbalists understood the relationship between God and world, between the hidden and the revealed. During the early medieval period, as Jewish communities spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, these mystical traditions continued to be transmitted, though often in restricted circles and under conditions of great secrecy. The idea that certain knowledge was too dangerous or too sacred to be taught openly became deeply embedded in Jewish mystical culture. The Talmud itself had established restrictions on the teaching of esoteric matters, forbidding the public exposition of the creation narrative to more than one student at a time, and the merkavah vision to any but the wise who could understand through their own knowledge. This tension between the desire to preserve and transmit mystical wisdom and the conviction that such wisdom must be carefully guarded from those unprepared to receive it would shape the history of Kabbalah throughout its development. The mystical traditions of this early period were not monolithic or systematic. Different texts emphasized different practices and ideas. Some focused on ascent experiences and the vision of the divine throne. Others concentrated on the power of divine names and the use of magical techniques for protection or healing. Still others pursued more philosophical or contemplative approaches, seeking understanding rather than vision, wisdom rather than power. What united these diverse streams was a shared conviction that the surface of things concealed depths that were worth exploring, that the ordinary religious life, while valuable and necessary, was not the whole story. There were secrets to be discovered, mysteries to be penetrated, and for those who devoted themselves to the quest with purity of heart and rigorous discipline, there existed the possibility of touching something beyond the veil of everyday existence. The political and social circumstances of Jewish life during these centuries profoundly shaped the development of mystical thought. As a minority people living under Christian and Muslim rule, Jews often found themselves in precarious positions, subject to restrictions, persecutions, and periodic violence. In such circumstances, mystical speculation offered both consolation and a sense of hidden power. If the outer world was hostile and threatening, there remained an inner world, a realm of spiritual reality where the divine presence could still be encountered, where Israel retained its cosmic significance, even when politically powerless. The mystics insisted that behind the apparent chaos and injustice of historical events, there operated a hidden divine order, a providential design that would ultimately lead to redemption. This conviction gave meaning to suffering and sustained hope in dark times. Yet the early mystics were also deeply concerned with practical righteousness and ethical behavior. The merkavah texts often emphasize that only those who observe the commandments faithfully and conduct themselves with moral integrity can safely undertake the ascent to the divine chariot. Mystical experience was not seen as a substitute for ethical living, but as its culmination, available only to those who had already established a foundation of righteous conduct. This integration of mysticism with ethics, of esoteric knowledge with exoteric practice, would remain a characteristic feature of Jewish mysticism even as it evolved into the elaborate systems of medieval Kabbalah. The transmission of mystical knowledge took place primarily through oral teaching and personal relationship between master and disciple. Written texts existed, but they were often deliberately obscure, requiring the guidance of a teacher to unlock their meaning. The relationship between teacher and student was intimate and intense, based on trust and careful assessment of the student's readiness to receive advanced teachings. A master would observe a potential student over time, evaluating not only intellectual capacity but moral character, psychological stability, and spiritual sincerity. Only when satisfied that the student was prepared would the master begin to reveal the deeper mysteries. This pedagogical approach meant that mystical knowledge was inherently elitist, accessible only to a small number of individuals in any generation who possessed the necessary qualities and dedication. As the first millennium of the Common Era drew to a close, the various strands of early Jewish mysticism had established patterns that would continue to shape Kabbalistic thought in the centuries ahead. The idea that reality has multiple levels, from the most material to the most spiritual, with intermediate realms connecting them, had become firmly established. The conviction that language, especially Hebrew letters and divine names, possessed creative and transformative power had been articulated and explored. The practices of meditation, contemplation, and altered states of consciousness had been developed and refined. The ethical framework insisting that mystical knowledge must be grounded in righteous living had been firmly established, and the tension between the impulse to share transformative wisdom and the conviction that such wisdom must be carefully guarded had been encoded into the mystical tradition itself. All of these elements would persist and develop as Kabbalah entered its next phase of growth, when the scattered seeds planted in antiquity would begin to flower in the gardens of medieval Spain and Germany, producing a rich harvest of mystical speculation that would transform Jewish life and thought in ways that the early mystics could scarcely have imagined. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed a remarkable flowering of Jewish mystical thought across the diverse landscape of medieval Europe. In the Rhineland communities of Germany, in the sophisticated urban centers of Provence, and especially in the vibrant Jewish quarters of Christian Spain, new forms of mystical speculation emerged, that would transform the scattered traditions of earlier centuries into something more systematic, more ambitious, and more philosophically sophisticated. This was the period when the term Kabbalah, meaning reception or tradition, began to be used specifically for these mystical teachings, emphasizing their claim to be authentic transmissions of ancient wisdom rather than novel innovations. The mystics of this era saw themselves not as inventors but as recoverers, men who were bringing to light secrets that had always existed but had been hidden, waiting for the right generation to receive them. In the Jewish communities along the Rhine River, in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, a distinctive form of mystical piety developed among a group known as the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious ones of Germany. These were not Kabbalists in the technical sense that would later develop in Spain, but their approach to religious life and their mystical speculations would influence the broader mystical tradition. The Hasidei Ashkenaz emerged in the aftermath of the Crusades, which had brought devastating violence to the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. The First Crusade in particular, launched in the late 11th century, had resulted in massacres of entire Jewish communities by crusading armies and local mobs. In the face of this trauma, the Hasidei Ashkenaz developed a spirituality centered on extreme asceticism, absolute devotion to the divine will, and a mystical theology that emphasized the transcendence and incomprehensibility of God. The leading figures of this movement, particularly Rabbi Judah the Pious and his disciple Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, composed texts that combined legal rulings, ethical teachings, and mystical speculation. The Sefer Hasidim, the Book of the Pious, presented a vision of religious life that went far beyond the minimum requirements of Jewish law, demanding constant self-examination, rigorous control of desires, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for the sanctification of the divine name. The Hasidei Ashkenaz were particularly concerned with the concept of kavod, divine glory, which they understood as a created light through which God manifests to prophets and mystics. This allowed them to maintain the absolute transcendence of the divine essence while accounting for the biblical descriptions of seeing God. The glory was not God, but a vehicle through which God made divine presence perceptible to human consciousness. The mystical theology of the Hasidei Ashkenaz also included elaborate speculations on the names of God, on angelic beings, and on the hidden meanings of prayers and commandments. They developed complex numerological systems based on the Hebrew alphabet, finding hidden connections between words and concepts that shared the same numerical value. This technique, called gematria, became a standard tool of Kabbalistic interpretation. The German pietists also emphasized the importance of intention in prayer, teaching that the mechanical recitation of words was worthless without proper focus and devotion. They composed meditations designed to be recited before and during prayer, exercises to help the worshipper achieve the necessary state of consciousness. While the Hasidei Ashkenaz did not develop a systematic Kabbalistic theology of the type that would emerge in Spain, their emphasis on inner experience, on the mystical significance of ritual, and on the hidden dimensions of Scripture prepared the ground for later developments. Meanwhile, in southern France and northern Spain, a different form of mysticism was taking shape. The Provence region, culturally positioned between the Christian north and Muslim south, between rationalist philosophy and mystical gnosis, became a crucial crucible for early Kabbalah. Here, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, texts began to circulate that spoke of 10 sefirot, divine emanations or attributes through which the infinite God manifested and created the world. These were not the simple numerical principles of the ancient Sefer Yetzirah, but a complex hierarchical system representing different aspects of the divine life. The sefirot had names: crown, wisdom, understanding, kindness, severity, beauty, endurance, splendor, foundation, and kingdom. They were arranged in patterns, often depicted as a tree or as the form of a cosmic human figure. They represented both attributes of God and stages in the process of creation. This theosophical Kabbalah, as it came to be called, represented a bold and potentially controversial development in Jewish thought. By positing a complex internal structure within the divine realm, the Kabbalists seemed to compromise the absolute unity of God that was central to Jewish monotheism. Their teachings required careful formulation to avoid charges of polytheism or dualism. The Kabbalists responded by insisting that the sefirot were not separate entities, but aspects of the one divine reality, like white light refracted through a prism into colors. The sefirot were how the infinite Ein Sof, the limitless divine source, became accessible and manifest. Without them, the gap between the transcendent God and the finite world would be unbridgeable. The sefirot were the instruments of creation, the channels through which divine energy flowed into the lower worlds. The doctrine of the sefirot was not merely a cosmological speculation, but had profound implications for religious practice. If the sefirot represented the divine structure through which the world was created and sustained, then human actions, particularly the performance of the commandments, could have effects within the divine realm itself. Prayer and ritual became not merely acts of obedience or expressions of devotion, but theurgic operations that maintained or restored the proper balance and flow within the sephirotic system. This gave immense cosmic significance to even the smallest religious act. When a Jew performed a commandment with proper intention, they were not merely obeying divine law, but actively participating in the maintenance of cosmic order, ensuring the proper flow of divine blessing into the world. The early Kabbalists of Provence and Catalonia formed small circles, often based around a master teacher who would share these doctrines with carefully selected students. One of the most influential early groups gathered around Rabbi Isaac the Blind in Provence in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Isaac the Blind, despite his physical blindness, or perhaps because of the symbolic significance later attributed to it, was regarded as possessing profound insight into mystical matters. He taught that the highest sephira, keter, or crown, was the first emanation from the unknowable Ein Sof, and that contemplation should focus on the sefirot as the revealed aspect of the divine, rather than attempting to grasp the infinite essence directly. His students would carry these teachings southward into Spain, where they would encounter other mystical traditions and philosophical currents that would further enrich and complicate Kabbalistic thought. In Spain, Kabbalah encountered a Jewish culture marked by philosophical sophistication, prosperity, and relative security under Muslim and then Christian rule. Spanish Jews had produced towering philosophical minds like Moses Maimonides, whose rationalist approach to Judaism emphasized the limits of human knowledge about God and the dangers of anthropomorphic thinking. The Kabbalists both learned from and reacted against Maimonidean rationalism. They shared the philosopher's concern with avoiding crude literalism in reading scripture, but they rejected the rationalist reduction of ritual to mere pedagogical tools or social conventions. For the Kabbalists, rituals had real power and significance, not because they educated the masses, but because they affected the divine realm itself. Prayer was not merely a disciplined way of cultivating proper attitudes, but a force that literally moved the sefirot and influenced the flow of divine energy. One of the most distinctive figures in 13th century Spanish Kabbalah was Abraham Abulafia, who developed what he called prophetic Kabbalah in contrast to the theosophical Kabbalah of the sefirot. Abulafia was less interested in mapping the divine structure than in achieving direct mystical experience through meditation on the Hebrew letters and divine names. He developed elaborate techniques of letter permutation, where the practitioner would mentally combine and recombine Hebrew letters in systematic patterns while controlling breathing and performing specific head movements. This practice, which Abulafia compared to music and which he believed could induce prophetic states, represented a continuation of the older merkavah traditions adapted to new philosophical frameworks. Abulafia understood prophecy not as supernatural intervention, but as a natural human capacity that could be developed through proper training, bringing human consciousness into alignment with the active intellect described in Aristotelian philosophy. Abulafia was a controversial figure, claiming prophetic status and even attempting to convert the Pope to Judaism, an audacious and dangerous mission that nearly cost him his life. His messianic pretensions and his willingness to teach his methods widely, even writing manuals that explained his techniques in detail, troubled more conservative Kabbalists who believed such knowledge should be carefully restricted. Yet his writings were copied and studied, and his methods influenced later mystical practice. He represented one pole of Kabbalistic thought, the emphasis on personal experience, on techniques that could be taught and practiced, on mysticism as a path of transformation available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary discipline. The other pole was represented by the theosophical Kabbalists who focused on understanding the divine structure and the cosmic significance of ritual. For them, the key was not personal experience or altered states of consciousness, but knowledge of the sephirotic system and the proper intentions that should accompany ritual performance. These Kabbalists produced increasingly detailed and complex expositions of the sefirot, explaining how different commandments affected different configurations of the divine powers, how masculine and feminine aspects operated within the divine realm, how the forces of judgment and mercy needed to be balanced to ensure the proper flow of blessing into the world. They developed an elaborate symbolic language in which every detail of scripture and ritual could be decoded to reveal its sephirotic significance. By the mid-13th century, Kabbalah had established itself as a significant force within Spanish Jewish life. Kabbalistic circles existed in most major communities, often centered around respected rabbinic authorities who combined traditional Talmudic learning with mystical speculation. These were not fringe groups, but influential teachers whose interpretations were sought and valued. At the same time, Kabbalah remained an esoteric discipline, taught primarily in private sessions to qualified students rather than in public lectures. The Kabbalists wrote their texts in deliberately obscure language filled with symbolic terminology that would be opaque to outsiders. Terms like sefirot were common knowledge, but the detailed doctrines about relationships between the sefirot, about the sexual symbolism used to describe divine union, about the dangers of the demonic realm, were shared more cautiously. The social structure of Kabbalistic transmission created both stability and tension. On one hand, it ensured that mystical doctrines were not wildly misinterpreted or misused by unprepared individuals. The requirement that students be mature, learned in Talmud and Halakha, and of good character before receiving Kabbalistic teaching meant that mysticism remained grounded in traditional Jewish practice and values. On the other hand, this elitism created resentment and criticism. Some accused the Kabbalists of creating an aristocracy of knowledge, of hoarding wisdom that should be shared more widely. Others questioned whether these doctrines were truly ancient traditions or medieval innovations dressed up as received wisdom. The Kabbalists responded by producing increasingly elaborate accounts of the transmission of their teachings, tracing lineages back through generations of masters to the ancient sages and even to divine revelation itself. The relationship between Kabbalah and philosophy remained complex and often tense throughout this period. Some Kabbalists had philosophical training and incorporated philosophical concepts into their systems, using Neoplatonic ideas about emanation or Aristotelian psychology to explain mystical experiences. Others rejected philosophy as a Greek contamination of pure Jewish wisdom, insisting that the ancient mystical tradition represented a separate and superior path to truth. Most Kabbalists occupied a middle position, respecting philosophical inquiry within its proper sphere, but insisting that there were dimensions of reality and forms of knowledge that philosophy could not reach. The deepest truths about God and creation, they argued, came not through logical demonstration, but through revelation tradition and mystical insight. The spread of Kabbalah throughout the Jewish communities of Christian Spain in the 13th century represented more than the dissemination of a particular set of doctrines. It marked a shift in how many Jews understood the nature of their religious life and the significance of their practices. The world became re-enchanted, filled with hidden correspondences and spiritual significance. Every prayer, every ritual act, every word of Torah study resonated through multiple levels of reality. The Jewish people were not merely recipients of divine commandments, but active participants in cosmic drama, their actions maintaining the balance of creation and hastening the ultimate redemption. This vision would find its fullest and most influential expression in a remarkable text that appeared toward the end of the 13th century, a book that would reshape Jewish mysticism and secure Kabbalah's place at the center of Jewish spiritual life. In the final decades of the 13th century, manuscripts began to circulate in the Jewish communities of Castile that would fundamentally alter the landscape of Jewish mysticism. These manuscripts claimed to contain the teachings of the 2nd century sage Shimon bar Yochai, who, according to rabbinic legend, had hidden in a cave for 13 years to escape Roman persecution, emerging with profound mystical insights revealed to him by the prophet Elijah. The texts were written in a distinctive Aramaic, presented as conversations between Rabbi Shimon and his circle of disciples as they wandered through the hills of Galilee, discoursing on the hidden meanings of Torah and the mysteries of the divine realm. This was the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, and it would become the central text of Kabbalistic literature, reshaping how generations of Jews understood scripture, ritual, and the nature of divine reality. The actual author of the Zohar was almost certainly Moses de Leon, a Kabbalist living in the small Castilian town of Guadalajara, who had studied with various masters and absorbed the mystical traditions that had developed over the previous century. Moses de Leon was not a wealthy man, and in the 1280s and 1290s he began distributing sections of this remarkable text, selling or lending manuscripts to interested parties, claiming that he was copying from an ancient book that had come into his possession. The attribution to Shimon bar Yochai gave the text tremendous authority. Here was not medieval speculation, but ancient wisdom, teachings that dated back to the Tannaitic period, contemporary with the Mishnah itself. The archaic Aramaic in which the text was written seemed to confirm its antiquity, and the fact that it referenced and interpreted passages from throughout the Hebrew Bible in ways that seemed fresh and profound convinced many readers that they were encountering genuine ancient tradition. Not everyone was convinced. Even in Moses de Leon's lifetime, some questioned the authenticity of the text. After his death, there were investigations into the manuscript's origins, with some claiming that Moses de Leon's widow had admitted her husband composed it himself. Yet these doubts did not prevent the Zohar from spreading rapidly through the Kabbalistic community and beyond. Within a few generations, it had achieved canonical status, treated by most Kabbalists as authoritative, ancient tradition, regardless of questions about its actual composition. The pseudepigraphic attribution, whether understood as pious fiction or genuine transmission, served important functions. It located Kabbalistic teaching at the heart of rabbinic tradition rather than positioning it as a medieval innovation. It suggested that the mystical interpretation of Torah was not a layer added to Scripture but had been present from the beginning, known to the ancient sages even if concealed from most readers. The Zohar is a massive and complex work consisting of multiple sections with different literary styles and varying degrees of mystical density. The main body presents a running mystical commentary on the Torah, following the weekly portions read in synagogue, but frequently digressing into extended explorations of particular themes or symbols. There are narrative sections where Rabbi Shimon, and his companions encounter other figures, engage in theological debates, or experience revelations. There are lengthy discourses on the nature of the sefirot, on the structure of the divine names, on the significance of the Hebrew letters. There are allegorical interpretations of biblical narratives transforming the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs into cosmic dramas played out within the divine realm. There are sections on eschatology and redemption, on the nature of the soul, on the mysteries of death and afterlife. What made the Zohar revolutionary was not primarily the introduction of new doctrines, but rather the way it integrated existing Kabbalistic ideas into a comprehensive, symbolic universe and presented them in a mythic, imaginative style quite different from the more analytical expositions of earlier Kabbalists. The Zohar spoke of the sefirot not merely as abstract emanations, but as living divine personalities with complex relationships. It developed an elaborate sexual symbolism, describing the union of masculine and feminine aspects within the Godhead, the cosmic marriage of Tiferet and Malkut, beauty and kingdom, which must be maintained through proper human action. It portrayed the divine life as dynamic rather than static, constantly responding to human behavior, affected by prayer and ritual, threatened by demonic forces, seeking completion through partnership with Israel. The Zohar's treatment of Scripture was bold and imaginative. It insisted that the Torah had multiple levels of meaning, that the literal narratives about human beings and historical events were merely the outer garments concealing deeper spiritual truths. The patriarchs were not just historical figures, but representations of the sefirot. Their actions were not merely exemplary moral tales, but keys to understanding the dynamics of the divine realm. Every detail of the biblical text, every apparently superfluous word or unusual grammatical form, concealed mystical significance for those who knew how to read properly. The true Torah was infinite, containing all possible wisdom, and the written text was just the most external manifestation of this inexhaustible spiritual reality. This approach to Scripture gave the Zohar enormous creative freedom. It could take a brief biblical verse and spin out pages of mystical interpretation, finding in simple words entire cosmological systems. When the Torah says that God created light on the first day, the Zohar explains that this was not physical light, which was created on the fourth day with the sun and stars, but a primordial spiritual light that God hid away for the righteous in the world to come. When Scripture describes God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, the Zohar interprets this as referring to movements within the sephirotic structure. The binding of Isaac becomes a drama about the balance between mercy and severity in the divine attributes. The love poetry of the Song of Songs becomes an allegory of the relationship between God and Israel, but also of the relationships between different sefirot, the sacred marriage that sustains the cosmos. The Zohar also developed detailed teachings about the human soul, describing it as having multiple levels or aspects. The lowest level, nefesh, was the vital soul that animates the body. Above it was ruach, the spirit, associated with emotions and moral awareness. Higher still was neshama, the higher soul that connects to the divine realm. Some passages describe even higher levels, reaching up to the divine source itself. This stratified understanding of the soul corresponded to the stratified structure of the cosmos. Just as the divine realm contained multiple levels from the infinite Ein Sof down through the Sefirot to the material world, so the human person contained multiple levels from the body up through various soul aspects to pure spirit. Human beings were microcosms, miniature versions of the cosmic structure, and understanding oneself meant understanding the architecture of reality itself. The relationship between the upper and lower worlds in Zoharic thought was intimate and reciprocal. Human actions did not merely express obedience to divine command, but actually affected the divine realm. This theurgic understanding of ritual gave immense significance to religious practice. When a Jew performed a commandment with proper mystical intention, they were not only fulfilling an obligation but participating in cosmic repair, ensuring the proper flow of divine energy through the sefirot, maintaining the union of masculine and feminine aspects in the Godhead, defeating the forces of the demonic realm that constantly sought to intercept and corrupt the divine flow. Prayer became a way of directing consciousness to different sefirot, of facilitating the proper relationships between divine powers, of drawing down blessing from the upper worlds. The Zohar also gave great attention to the demonic realm, the Sitra Achra or other side. This was not a separate creation but emerged from the sephirotic system itself, particularly from the strict judgment aspect of the divine when separated from mercy. The demonic forces were parasitic, feeding on divine energy that they could intercept when human sin disrupted the proper flow through the sefirot. The Zohar described in vivid detail various classes of demons and spirits, their hierarchies and habitations, the dangers they posed to human souls. Yet it also insisted that even these dark forces ultimately served divine purposes, that the existence of evil was necessary for human free will and moral meaning. The cosmic drama involved not just maintaining divine harmony, but battling the forces of darkness that sought to disrupt that harmony. The literary style of the Zohar was unlike anything in earlier Hebrew or Aramaic literature. It was elusive and poetic, often cryptic, moving rapidly between different levels of discourse. A passage might begin with a straightforward question about a biblical verse, shift into a mythological narrative about divine emanations, then suddenly insert a story about Rabbi Shimon and his disciples encountering a mysterious figure who turns out to be Elijah in disguise, who then offers a teaching that reframes the original question in unexpected ways. The text made liberal use of dramatic devices, creating suspense about mystical revelations, describing the physical and emotional reactions of the disciples as they received profound teachings, occasionally having Rabbi Shimon interrupt an exposition to rebuke a disciple who has misunderstood or to praise one who has grasped a subtle point. This narrative richness made the Zohar both more accessible and more mysterious than earlier Kabbalistic texts. The stories and conversations gave readers entry points into the material, human drama that made the abstract doctrines more engaging. At the same time, the very opacity of much of the symbolism, the way the text often gestured toward mysteries it did not fully explain, created a sense that enormous depths remained to be plumbed, that one could return to passages repeatedly and continue to find new meanings. The Zohar became an inexhaustible resource for meditation and interpretation, a text that rewarded sustained attention while never completely yielding its secrets. The spread of the Zohar through the Kabbalistic world was remarkably rapid. Within a generation of its appearance, it was being studied and commented upon in communities throughout Spain and beyond. Kabbalists recognized that this text synthesized and organized the various strands of mystical teaching that had been developing separately, providing a common reference point and vocabulary. The Zohar became the lens through which earlier Kabbalistic literature was read and the foundation on which later developments would build. To be a Kabbalist increasingly meant to be a student of the Zohar, to have internalized its symbolic language and its way of reading Torah. Yet the Zohar's success also created challenges. Its symbolic and elusive style meant that it required interpretation, and different readers could understand the same passage in quite different ways. Its mythological presentation of the divine life, with its bold sexual imagery and its descriptions of divine personalities, troubled some readers who worried that it compromised Jewish monotheism or encouraged crude anthropomorphism. The text's claim to ancient authorship became both a source of authority and a point of vulnerability as more sophisticated readers recognized anachronisms and detected medieval doctrines beneath the archaic language. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, as the Zohar established itself as central to Kabbalistic study, these tensions would produce both devoted commentators who worked to explain and systematize its teachings, and critics who questioned its orthodoxy or authenticity. The Zohar appeared at a particular moment in Spanish Jewish history that would soon be overshadowed by tragedy. The late 13th and 14th centuries saw increasing pressure on Jewish communities from Christian authorities, forced disputations, economic restrictions, and periodic violence. The Great Catastrophe would come in 1391 with riots that destroyed Jewish communities throughout the Iberian Peninsula, killing thousands and forcing many more to convert to Christianity. The Jewish cultural world that had nurtured the Zohar's creation would never fully recover, yet the text itself would survive, copied and studied by the communities that continued, eventually finding its way to new centers of Jewish life in Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and Eastern Europe. The Zohar had arrived at the end of Spanish Jewry's golden age, but it would accompany the Jewish people into exile, shaping their spiritual life through the difficult centuries ahead, and eventually inspiring new forms of Kabbalistic creativity that would respond to the challenges of a world transformed by expulsion and dispersion. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 shattered one of the most vibrant centers of Jewish learning and culture that had ever existed. The edict issued by Ferdinand and Isabella gave the Jewish community a matter of months to either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Tens of thousands chose exile, abandoning homes, properties, and communities that had existed for centuries. They scattered across the Mediterranean world, carrying with them not only their physical possessions but their books, their traditions, and their memories of what had been lost. Among the treasures they carried was the Zohar and the rich Kabbalistic tradition that had developed around it. This traumatic uprooting would paradoxically create conditions for a remarkable flowering of mystical creativity in a small Galilean town that became, for a brief period in the 16th century, the undisputed center of the Jewish mystical world. Safed, perched in the mountains of Upper Galilee, had been a modest town of little significance in Jewish history, but in the decades following the Spanish expulsion, it attracted an extraordinary gathering of scholars, mystics, poets, and refugees who transformed it into a spiritual powerhouse. The town's location in the land of Israel gave it special significance for Jews who saw the return to the Holy Land as a step toward redemption. Its cool mountain climate and relative tolerance under Ottoman rule made it practically attractive. But what truly distinguished Seft was the concentration of mystical genius that assembled there in the mid-16th century. Within a few square miles lived some of the most creative and influential Kabbalists who ever lived, men whose innovations would reshape Jewish spirituality for centuries to come. The Seft community developed distinctive practices that reflected their mystical consciousness. They would go out into the fields at dusk on Friday afternoons to welcome the Sabbath, singing psalms and mystical poems that addressed the Sabbath as a bride and queen. This practice, based on Zoharic symbolism that identified the Sabbath with the 10th sefirot of Malkut, the feminine aspect of the divine, became ritualized as the Kabbalat Shabbat service that is still performed in synagogues around the world. They practiced midnight vigils, rising in the dead of night to mourn the destruction of the temple and the exile of the divine presence, studying Torah and reciting psalms in a ritual called tikkun shatzo. They would make pilgrimages to the tombs of ancient sages scattered throughout the Galilee, praying at these holy sites for inspiration and blessing. Among the Seft mystics, several figures stood out for their particular contributions. Moses Cordovero, known as the Ramak, was a systematic thinker who worked to organize and rationalize the often bewildering complexity of Zoharic Kabbalah. His massive work, Pardes Rimenim, the Orchard of Pomegranates, attempted to explain all the major concepts of Kabbalah in clear, logical fashion, reconciling apparent contradictions in earlier texts and creating a comprehensive theological system. Cordovero emphasized the unity underlying the multiplicity of the sefirot, explaining how all the divine emanations were ultimately one reality viewed from different perspectives. He was deeply concerned with maintaining proper theological boundaries, ensuring that Kabbalistic speculation did not slide into heresy or confusion. His works became standard textbooks for students beginning their Kabbalistic education, providing the systematic foundation that the poetic and elusive Zohar did not offer. Solomon Alkabetz was the poet whose composition, Leka Dodi, Come My Beloved, became the centerpiece of the Friday evening Kabbalat Shabbat service. This liturgical poem wove together biblical verses, Zoharic symbolism, and messianic hope into a devotional masterpiece that expressed the mystical understanding of the Sabbath as divine bride, while also calling for the restoration of Jerusalem and the ingathering of exiles. The song embodied the safe synthesis of mystical theology and lived devotion, translating abstract Kabbalistic concepts into emotionally powerful poetry that anyone could sing and feel. Joseph Caro, though best known as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the authoritative code of Jewish law that organized and clarified halakhic practice for the early modern period, was also a mystic who kept a detailed diary of his encounters with a heavenly mentor, a personified voice of the Mishnah that would speak to him in trance states, offering mystical interpretations and ethical guidance. Caro's dual role as both legal authority and visionary mystic exemplified the safe integration of halakhic rigor with mystical passion. For the Safed Kabbalists, legal precision and mystical creativity were not opposing poles but complementary aspects of a comprehensive religious life. Yet the figure who would have the most profound and lasting impact on the development of Kabbalah was Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, the Lion. Luria arrived in Saft in 1570, already recognized as a prodigious scholar and mystic. He had spent years in Egypt, studying earlier Kabbalistic texts in intense seclusion, engaging in severe ascetic practices and receiving, he claimed, visitations from the prophet Elijah, who instructed him in mystical secrets. In Saft, he gathered a small circle of devoted disciples to whom he taught an entirely new Kabbalistic system, one that reframed all of earlier Kabbalah and offered revolutionary answers to the fundamental questions of existence. Luria himself wrote almost nothing, preferring to teach orally, but his disciples, particularly Hayim Vital, carefully recorded his teachings, and after Luria's death in 1572, just 2 years after arriving in Safed, these writings began to circulate and gradually became the dominant form of Kabbalah. The Lurianic system began with a radical rethinking of the process of creation. Earlier, Kabbalah had understood creation as a process of emanation, divine light flowing outward from the Ein Sof through the sefirot into the lower worlds. But Luria asked a more fundamental question. How could creation occur at all if God was infinite and filled all possible space? If God was truly everywhere, where was there room for a world? Luria's answer was the doctrine of tzimtzum, contraction or withdrawal. Before creation, God contracted the divine presence, withdrawing from a primordial space to create a void, an emptiness within the infinite divine fullness. Into this void, God then emanated a ray of light, beginning the process of creation. This meant that creation was not simply emanation, but involved a double movement, first withdrawal, then emanation. The world came into being not through divine expansion, but through divine contraction, through God making room for otherness. This concept of tzimtzum would have profound implications for Jewish theology and philosophy. It suggested that God's relationship to the world involved self-limitation, that divine transcendence and immanence were both real and both necessary. It offered a new way of thinking about divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. If God had withdrawn to make space for creation, then the experience of divine absence was built into the structure of reality itself. Some interpreters would later read Tzimtzum literally as actual divine withdrawal, while others understood it metaphorically as referring to the concealment of divine presence rather than actual absence. But in either reading, Tzimtzum became one of the most influential and debated concepts in all of Jewish mystical thought. The next stage in the Lurianic creation narrative was even more dramatic. After the initial Tzimtzum and the emanation of light into the void, God began to organize this light into vessels, containers that would hold and structure the divine energy, forming the sefirot. But something went catastrophically wrong. The vessels of the lower sefirot could not contain the intensity of the light being poured into them, and they shattered. This was the shevirat ha-kelim, the breaking of the vessels, a cosmic catastrophe that disrupted the intended order of creation. The shards of the broken vessels, still containing sparks of divine light, fell downward, becoming the source of material existence and of evil. The world as it exists is thus a broken world, a reality that is not functioning as it was meant to function, where divine sparks are trapped in alien shells, where the sacred is mixed with the profane, where disorder and suffering are fundamental features rather than mere imperfections. This myth of cosmic catastrophe gave Luria a powerful way of explaining the existence of evil and suffering without compromising God's goodness or power. The brokenness of the world was not punishment for human sin, since it occurred before humanity existed. It was built into the very structure of creation, though the reasons for it remained mysterious, hinted at in terms of divine necessity for limitation and otherness. The breaking of the vessels meant that creation as it existed was not yet complete, that the world was in a state of cosmic exile, fragmented and waiting for repair. The third major concept in Lurianic Kabbalah was tikkun, repair or restoration. If the world was in a state of brokenness due to the shattering of the vessels, then the purpose of human existence was to participate in the cosmic repair, to liberate the trapped divine sparks and restore them to their proper place. Every human action, particularly the performance of religious commandments, had the potential to raise sparks, to extract holiness from its imprisonment in the material realm and reunite it with its divine source. When performed with proper mystical intention, prayer and ritual became acts of cosmic redemption, literally fixing the broken structure of reality. The Jewish people, through their exile and suffering, were uniquely positioned to perform this work of tikkun because their historical experience mirrored the cosmic situation. Just as the divine sparks were in exile among the shells of impurity, so Israel was in exile among the nations. Luria taught that the souls of Israel had been present at the breaking of the vessels and carried within them fragments of those shattered divine vessels. Through reincarnation, souls returned again and again, each lifetime offering opportunities to repair particular spiritual damage, to liberate particular sparks. This gave profound meaning to individual existence and to specific commandments. Every person had a unique role in the cosmic drama, particular sparks that only they could raise, particular repairs that only they could perform. No one was irrelevant or insignificant. The humblest act done with proper intention could tip the cosmic balance toward redemption. The Lurianic myth resonated deeply with the historical experience of Spanish Jewry and the wider Jewish world in the post-expulsion period. Here was a cosmology that made sense of catastrophe, that found cosmic significance in exile and suffering, that insisted the world was objectively broken rather than blaming the victim for their misfortunes. The breaking of the vessels validated the sense that something was profoundly wrong with reality, while the doctrine of tikkun offered purpose and agency, transforming Jews from passive sufferers into active agents of cosmic repair. The system was psychologically compelling and spiritually empowering in ways that earlier Kabbalah, with its emphasis on maintaining cosmic harmony, was not. Luria also developed elaborate kavanot, mystical intentions to be held during prayer and ritual performance. These were complex meditations on divine names, combinations of letters, and visualizations of sephirotic configurations. Each word of each prayer corresponded to specific operations within the divine realm, and the practitioner needed to know which divine names to focus on, which sefirot to direct consciousness toward, which permutations of letters would facilitate the desired spiritual effect. The kavanot was so intricate that they required extensive study to master, and prayer could become an intellectually and spiritually demanding practice, requiring hours of preparation and concentration. The intense focus on individual intention and the cosmic significance of every action in Lurianic Kabbalah created both tremendous spiritual depth and potential psychological burden. On one hand, it made religious life infinitely meaningful, transforming even mundane acts into sacred work. On the other hand, it could generate anxiety about performing everything perfectly, fear that a single mistake might have disastrous cosmic consequences. Some practitioners found this empowering, while others found it overwhelming. The Safed community developed elaborate systems of ethical and spiritual discipline to prepare the soul for this demanding practice, including fasting, ritual immersion, confession of sins, and various forms of asceticism. Hayim Vital, Luria's primary disciple, spent decades after his master's death recording, organizing, and elaborating the Lurianic teachings. His massive work, Etz Hayim, the Tree of Life, along with numerous other writings, attempted to preserve everything he had learned from Luria and to work out the implications of the system in exhaustive detail. Vital was protective of these teachings, insisting that he was Luria's only authentic interpreter and attempting to control access to the material. But manuscripts circulated despite his efforts, and within a generation of Luria's death, his teachings had spread throughout the Jewish world, carried by emissaries and students who had studied in Safed or obtained copies of the texts. The Lurianic revolution transformed Kabbalah from an elite discipline studied by small circles of specialists into something that increasingly influenced broader Jewish practice and consciousness. The concepts were too complex for most people to master in detail, but simplified versions of Lurianic ideas about cosmic repair and the significance of observing commandments began to filter into popular Jewish culture. Prayer books began to include Lurianic kavanot, at least in abbreviated form. Ethical literature incorporated Lurianic concepts, the notion that human actions had cosmic significance, that every Jew participated in the work of redemption, became widespread. Safed had created not just a new theology, but a new sensibility, one that would define much of Jewish spirituality in the early modern period and beyond. The revolutionary power of Lurianic Kabbalah lay partly in its ability to give cosmic meaning to historical suffering and to frame redemption as something humans could actively hasten through their spiritual work. The concept of tikkun, of repairing the shattered vessels and liberating trapped divine sparks, was not merely metaphysical speculation but practical program. By the mid-17th century, Lurianic ideas had spread throughout the Jewish world, creating a widespread sense that redemption was imminent, that the messianic age could arrive at any moment if only enough spiritual work was performed, enough sparks raised, enough cosmic repair accomplished. This atmosphere of intense messianic expectation, combined with the traumatic circumstances of Jewish life in many regions, created conditions for one of the most dramatic and ultimately devastating episodes in the history of Jewish mysticism, the rise and fall of Sabbatai Zevi. Sabbatai Zevi was born in Smyrna in 1626 into a comfortable merchant family. From an early age, he demonstrated exceptional intellectual gifts and immersed himself in the study of Torah and Talmud. But he was also drawn to Kabbalah, particularly the Lurianic teachings that were then spreading through the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire. As a young man, Sabbatai exhibited unusual psychological characteristics that would today likely be diagnosed as bipolar disorder, periods of intense euphoria and spiritual illumination, alternating with stretches of deep depression and spiritual darkness. During his exalted states, he would engage in bizarre and antinomian behaviors, pronouncing the forbidden name of God, violating Jewish law in ways both minor and serious, claiming special religious status for himself. These actions led to his expulsion from several communities, and he spent years wandering from place to place, gathering followers who were drawn to his charisma and convinced of his spiritual gifts, while others viewed him as deranged or heretical. The transformation of Sabbatai from a troubled mystic into a messianic figure came through his encounter with Nathan of Gaza, a young Kabbalist of remarkable intellectual ability who became convinced that Sabbatai was the long-awaited Messiah. Nathan provided what Sabbatai himself had lacked, a theological framework that could explain and justify Sabbatai's strange behaviors, an organized movement that could spread the messianic message, and the intellectual sophistication to answer objections and doubts. Nathan developed a version of Lurianic Kabbalah in which Sabbatai's unusual soul required him to descend into the realms of impurity to liberate the most deeply trapped divine sparks. His violations of Jewish law were not sins but sacred missions, necessary transgressions undertaken for cosmic purposes. His psychological fluctuations were not illness, but reflected the drama of his soul's battles in the demonic realm. In 1665, Nathan publicly proclaimed Sabbatai as the Messiah, and the announcement spread like wildfire through the Jewish world. Communities from Yemen to Poland, from North Africa to Amsterdam, received reports of miracles, prophecies, and supernatural events surrounding Sabbatai. Mass hysteria gripped entire Jewish populations. People sold their possessions, neglected their businesses, engaged in fasting and penitential exercises to prepare for the imminent redemption. Skeptics were shouted down or ostracized. Respected rabbis endorsed Sabbatai's claims or at least refrained from opposing them publicly. The movement grew with astonishing speed, drawing in perhaps the majority of the world's Jewish population within months. Letters and pamphlets circulated describing wonders, prophets speaking in trance states, people levitating, visions of Sabbatai crowned as king. The messianic fervor was fueled by Lurianic teachings that had prepared people to see their age as uniquely positioned for redemption, that had given them a vocabulary of cosmic repair and spark-raising that Nathan skillfully deployed to interpret events. Sabbatai himself traveled to Constantinople, planning to take the crown from the Sultan and inaugurate the Messianic age. Instead, he was arrested and imprisoned. Even this did not dampen the enthusiasm of his followers, who interpreted his imprisonment through Kabbalistic lenses as a necessary descent into the realm of impurity, another stage in the cosmic drama of redemption. Nathan continued to issue prophecies and interpretations, maintaining that everything was proceeding according to divine plan. But in 1666, Sabbatai was brought before the Sultan and given a choice: convert to Islam or face execution. Sabbatai converted, taking the Turkish name Mehmed Efendi and beginning to live as a Muslim, though he retained some crypto-Jewish practices in private. The conversion was a catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the Jewish world. Communities that had staked everything on Sabbatai's messianic claims were left devastated, humiliated, and traumatized. The euphoria of 1665 gave way to profound disillusionment and shame. Many who had supported Sabbatai now denied they had ever believed in him, destroyed letters and documents that could prove their involvement, and tried to erase the episode from communal memory. Rabbis who had endorsed Sabbatai's claims faced loss of authority and position. Families were divided between those who continued to believe and those who had never believed or who now recanted. The social and psychological damage was immense. Yet remarkably, a significant number of followers did not abandon their belief. They followed Nathan of Gaza in developing an even more radical theology to explain the apostasy. The conversion, they claimed, was the ultimate descent into impurity, the final and most difficult stage of Sabbatai's mission to liberate the deepest spark. As the Messiah, Sabbatai had to enter the very heart of the demonic realm, and what appeared to be betrayal was actually the fulfillment of his sacred task. This theological move required increasingly antinomian interpretations of Lurianic Kabbalah. If the Messiah himself violated the most fundamental Jewish law by apostatizing, then perhaps the entire legal structure was about to be overturned. Perhaps the messianic age required the negation of the old law, the violation of boundaries, the mixing of categories that halakha carefully separated. The crypto-Sabbatean communities that persisted after 1666 developed elaborate systems of concealment and double meaning. They maintained external conformity to normative Jewish practice while harboring secret beliefs about Sabbatai's messianic status and engaging in private antinomian rituals. Some groups in the Ottoman Empire actually followed Sabbatai into apostasy, converting to Islam while maintaining secret Jewish and Sabbatean practices, forming a distinct sect known as the Dunme that would persist for centuries. In Poland and other European communities, Sabbatean believers became increasingly isolated and embattled, developing ever more radical interpretations that justified ritual violations and eventually led some to actively seek out transgressions as a form of religious observance. The most extreme development of post-Sabbatean messianism came with Jacob Frank in the 18th century. Frank was a charismatic figure who claimed to be the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, carrying forward the messianic mission that Sabbatai had begun. Frank took the antinomian logic of radical Sabbateanism to its ultimate conclusion, teaching that the way to redemption led through the systematic violation of all laws and moral boundaries. He encouraged sexual licentiousness, ritual violations, and ultimately led his followers into mass conversion to Christianity, though like the Dunme they maintained secret beliefs and practices. Frank's movement was smaller than Sabbateanism at its height, but it demonstrated how far the logic of redemptive transgression could be pushed, and how thoroughly Kabbalistic concepts could be twisted to support the most radical antinomianism. The Sabbatean crisis had profound and lasting effects on Jewish mysticism and Jewish life more broadly. The mainstream rabbinic community became deeply suspicious of messianic enthusiasm and of the popularization of Kabbalistic ideas. If teaching ordinary people about cosmic repair and imminent redemption could lead to the Sabbatean disaster, perhaps such knowledge needed to be more carefully restricted. There was a strong reaction against charismatic figures claiming special spiritual status, against mystical speculation that seemed to undermine halachic authority, against the kind of ecstatic religious experience that had characterized much of Lurianic practice. Rationalist critics of Kabbalah, who had always existed but had been marginalized during Kabbalah's ascendancy, now had powerful ammunition for their arguments that mysticism was dangerous and destabilizing. Yet Kabbalah itself did not disappear or even decline significantly in the wake of Sabbateanism. Instead, it underwent a process of careful reformulation. Kabbalists worked to distinguish legitimate mystical teaching from the heresies of Sabbateanism, to show that true Kabbalah supported, rather than undermined, rabbinic authority and halachic observance. They emphasized the importance of studying Kabbalah only under proper guidance, of maintaining strict boundaries between mystical speculation and practical halakha, of avoiding messianic calculation and excessive enthusiasm. The concepts of Lurianic Kabbalah, particularly Tzimtzum and tikkun, were too deeply embedded in Jewish consciousness to be abandoned, but they were reframed in ways that emphasized patient, gradual work rather than dramatic breakthroughs, steady observance rather than ecstatic transgression. The trauma of Sabbateanism also led to a kind of collective amnesia. Many communities tried to suppress documentation of their involvement in the movement, destroying letters and manuscripts, refusing to discuss the episode, treating it as a shameful aberration best forgotten. This made it difficult for subsequent historians to fully reconstruct what had happened and how widespread the movement actually was. Only in the 20th century would scholars like Gershom Scholem uncover the full extent of Sabbateanism and demonstrate that far from being a marginal phenomenon, it had been a central crisis that shaped modern Jewish consciousness in ways that continued to operate even after the explicit memory had been suppressed. The Sabbatean episode also revealed tensions within Kabbalistic thought that had always existed but had not been fully apparent. The Lurianic system, with its emphasis on human agency in cosmic repair, its teaching that redemption depended on human effort to raise sparks and perform tikkun, created what might be called a messianic activism, a sense that people could and should work actively to bring about the end of history. This was empowering but also dangerous because it could easily slide into the conviction that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures, that the rules that governed ordinary existence no longer applied when redemption was at hand. The conservative rabbinic establishment had always been nervous about this aspect of Kabbalah, preferring to emphasize patient study, careful observance, and trust in God's timing rather than human initiative in forcing messianic outcomes. At the same time, the Sabbatean affair demonstrated the power of Kabbalistic ideas to move masses of people, to give meaning to suffering, to generate hope and enthusiasm even under difficult circumstances. Whatever the theological problems or the social dangers, Kabbalah had proven itself as a force that could energize religious life, that spoke to deep human needs that dry legalism or abstract philosophy could not address. The question for the Jewish communities in the post-Sabbatean period was how to preserve what was valuable in Kabbalah while avoiding the dangers that had become so apparent. Different communities and different leaders would answer this question in various ways, leading to new forms of Jewish mysticism that tried to learn from the Sabbatean disaster while maintaining connection to the rich Kabbalistic tradition. In Eastern Europe, where Sabbateanism had found many adherents, and where the disillusionment was correspondingly severe, the stage was being set for a new development in Jewish mysticism that would take Kabbalistic ideas in a different direction. Rather than focusing on esoteric knowledge and complex kavanot accessible only to elite scholars, rather than emphasizing the catastrophic brokenness of the cosmos and the urgency of messianic repair, this new movement would democratize mysticism, making it accessible to ordinary people, and would focus on joy, devotion, and the immediate presence of God in everyday life. This was Hasidism, and while it emerged partly in reaction to Sabbateanism, it also drew deeply on the Kabbalistic tradition, translating its concepts into a new idiom and creating forms of religious life that would eventually transform much of Eastern European Jewry and establish patterns that continue to the present day. In the small towns and villages of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the early 18th century, Jewish life was difficult and often precarious. The majority of Jews lived in poverty, working as innkeepers, peddlers, and artisans in rural areas and small market towns. The great Talmudic academies served primarily the wealthy and intellectually gifted, while ordinary people struggled to acquire even basic Hebrew literacy. The elaborate Lurianic kavanot that required extensive knowledge of Kabbalistic symbolism and hours of meditative preparation were utterly inaccessible to those who worked from dawn to dusk to feed their families. The trauma of Sabbateanism had created suspicion toward enthusiastic religious expression and charismatic spiritual leaders. into this landscape came a figure who would transform Jewish mysticism from an elite intellectual discipline into a popular movement that touched the lives of hundreds of thousands, Israel ben Eliezer, who became known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. The historical facts about the Baal Shem Tov are difficult to separate from the legends that quickly accumulated around him. He was born around 1700, probably in the Podolia region of what is now Ukraine. He spent years in obscurity, working as a teacher's assistant, and then as an innkeeper in remote villages, engaging in solitary meditation and prayer in forests and fields. Around 1735, he began to emerge as a spiritual teacher and healer, using Kabbalistic techniques involving divine names and amulets to cure illnesses and solve problems. Such figures, known as Baalei Shem, or Masters of the Name, existed throughout Jewish Eastern Europe, combining folk healing with mystical practice. But the Baal Shem Tov was different from ordinary faith healers. He attracted disciples who were serious scholars, men who had studied in the traditional academies, and he gradually became the center of a movement that would challenge the established religious hierarchy and offer a new vision of Jewish spirituality. The Baal Shem Tov wrote nothing himself, and his teachings were transmitted orally and then recorded by disciples years after his death in 1760. The earliest collections of his sayings appeared in the 1780s, but by then they had been filtered through his students, shaped by the needs of the movement they were building. Nevertheless, certain core themes emerged consistently enough to give a sense of his distinctive message. At the heart of his teaching was an emphasis on devekut, cleaving or attachment to God. This was not a new concept. It appeared in earlier Hasidic literature from medieval Germany and in Lurianic texts, but the Baal Shem Tov democratized it, insisting that devekut was not only for elite mystics who had mastered complex meditative techniques, but was available to anyone through sincere, wholehearted devotion. The simple faith of an unlettered person could achieve more than the elaborate kavanot of a scholar if it came from genuine love and joy. This emphasis on sincerity and emotion over erudition and technique was revolutionary. It challenged the meritocracy of traditional Jewish learning that privileged those who could devote years to Talmudic study. It suggested that the essential thing was not what you knew, but how you felt, not the complexity of your intention, but the purity of your heart. The Baal Shem Tov taught that God could be found everywhere, in every moment and situation, not only in the study house during formal prayer, but in the marketplace, in conversation, in eating and drinking when done with proper awareness. This doctrine of divine immanence, that God fills all reality and can be encountered in the most mundane circumstances, gave cosmic significance to ordinary life and made mystical experience potentially available at any moment. The Baal Shem Tov also taught the value of joy in religious life. Traditional Jewish piety often emphasized mourning over sin, fear of divine judgment, and the gravity of religious obligation. The Baal Shem Tov did not deny the seriousness of transgression or the importance of repentance, but he insisted that serving God should be done with gladness and enthusiasm. Depression and sadness were themselves obstacles to spiritual life because they focused consciousness on the self rather than on God. When a person served God with joy, even if their knowledge was limited and their observance imperfect, the joy itself was pleasing to God. This teaching resonated with people whose lives were hard enough without their religion adding to their burden of sorrow and anxiety. It offered a path to spiritual fulfillment that began with acceptance and celebration rather than guilt and fear. Another central teaching concerned the elevation of fallen sparks through every human action. The Baal Shem Tov took the Lurianic concept of liberating trapped divine sparks and made it accessible and practical. He taught that every physical act, when done with proper consciousness of God's presence, could serve to raise sparks. Eating could be a sacred act if done with awareness that the food contains divine energy that is being liberated and returned to its source. Business dealings could be spiritual opportunities if conducted honestly and with recognition that one is serving God through honest work. Even casual conversation could become prayer if one spoke words of kindness or truth. This radical extension of the spiritual domain meant that one did not need to spend all day in the study house to be doing holy work. Every moment and every action carried spiritual potential. The Baal Shem Tov also emphasized the role of the tzaddik, the righteous person or spiritual master. While traditional Judaism recognized the category of the especially righteous, the Baal Shem Tov and his followers developed a new understanding of the tzaddik as a kind of spiritual mediator who could help others connect to God. The tzaddik was someone who had achieved such complete devekut that he remained constantly attached to God even while engaged in worldly activities. Through this connection, he could serve as a channel for divine blessing, interceding on behalf of his followers, healing their troubles, and guiding them toward their own spiritual development. This created a new social structure within Judaism. Communities organized around charismatic leaders whose authority derived not from rabbinic ordination or scholarly achievement, but from spiritual attainment and personal magnetism. After the Baal Shem Tov's death, his disciple Dov Ber, known as the Maggid of Mezerich, became the movement's leader and systematizer. The Maggid was more intellectually sophisticated than his master and worked to articulate Hasidic teachings in ways that engaged with Lurianic Kabbalah and responded to critiques from the traditional rabbinic establishment. He gathered around him a remarkable group of disciples who would spread Hasidism throughout Eastern Europe and develop distinctive regional traditions. Under the Maggid, Hasidism became more organized, more theological, and more self-consciously a movement rather than just the following of a single charismatic teacher. The Maggid taught that the highest form of worship was Bittul Hayesh, the nullification of being or ego. True devekut required transcending consciousness of self and becoming a pure vehicle for divine will. This teaching drew on Kabbalistic ideas about how human consciousness could unite with higher divine levels, but the Maggid made it more psychological and experiential. He described stages of spiritual development and techniques for achieving ego transcendence. His teachings were more demanding and complex than the Baal Shem Tov's populist message, creating a tension within Hasidism between accessibility and elitism that would continue throughout its history. Among the Maggid's disciples, several stood out for their particular contributions. Elimelech of Lizhensk further developed the theology of the tzaddik, emphasizing the role of the spiritual master as essential intermediary between God and the people. His teachings established patterns that would characterize Polish Hasidism, dynasties of tzaddikim passing leadership from father to son, large courts where followers would gather for festivals and seek the tzaddik's blessing and guidance, elaborate rituals surrounding the tzaddik's meals and prayers. Shneur Zalman of Liadi founded what became known as Chabad Hasidism, emphasizing intellectual understanding of mystical concepts alongside emotional devotion. He wrote the Tanya, a systematic exposition of Hasidic thought that became a classic of Jewish mystical literature and established Chabad as a more philosophically rigorous form of Hasidism. Levi Yitzchak of Berdichov became famous for his passionate advocacy on behalf of the Jewish people, arguing with God about divine justice and defending even the least observant Jews. His emotional, confrontational style of prayer became legendary, and he embodied the Hasidic emphasis on love over judgment, seeing the spark of holiness in every Jew, regardless of their behavior. Nachman of Breslov, great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, developed a deeply personal and psychological approach to spirituality, teaching about the struggles of faith, the value of spontaneous prayer in one's own language, and the importance of storytelling as a vehicle for mystical teaching. His tales, filled with fantastical imagery and multiple layers of meaning, became treasured texts that demonstrated how narrative could convey truths that systematic theology could not capture. These early Hasidic masters each emphasized different aspects of the tradition and developed distinctive approaches, but they shared core commitments: the accessibility of mystical experience, the importance of joy and enthusiasm in religious life, the doctrine of divine immanence, the spiritual significance of everyday actions, and the centrality of the tzaddik as guide and exemplar. They translated complex Kabbalistic concepts into more experiential and emotional terms. Where Lurianic Kabbalah spoke of technical operations within the sefirotic system, Hasidism spoke of love, attachment, joy, and awe. Where Lurianic practice required extensive knowledge and preparation, Hasidic practice emphasized sincerity and devotion accessible to anyone. Hasidism also developed distinctive forms of worship and communal life. Prayer became more prolonged and emotional, with melodies, dancing, and ecstatic gestures. The fixed liturgy was still used, but the manner of its performance changed dramatically. Hasidim would sway and move during prayer, sing wordless melodies called nigunim that were understood to bypass intellectual categories and communicate directly with the soul, and take hours for services that in traditional communities lasted perhaps an hour. They gathered for communal meals, tishes, where the tzaddik would offer teachings, distribute food that had spiritual significance through his blessing, and lead singing and celebration. These gatherings created intense communal bonds and distinctive Hasidic culture. The movement spread rapidly through the second half of the 18th century. By 1800, Hasidism had won over perhaps half the Jewish population of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and had established significant presence in Ukraine, Galicia, and Romania. In some towns, Hasidim became the majority, taking over communal institutions and marginalizing opponents. The success was due partly to the appeal of the teachings, partly to the charisma of the tzaddikim, and partly to social and economic factors that made people receptive to new forms of religious expression. The traditional rabbinic elite had become increasingly distant from ordinary Jews, living in a world of complex legal discourse that was incomprehensible to those without years of training. The Hasidic tzaddikim, by contrast, spoke in parables and stories, addressed people's immediate concerns, and offered tangible help through blessings and prayers. Yet this very success generated fierce opposition. The traditional rabbinic establishment, centered in Lithuania, but with representatives throughout Eastern Europe, viewed Hasidism with alarm and hostility. They saw it as a threat to Torah study, to halakhic authority, to the established social order. The Hasidic emphasis on prayer over study seemed to devalue the intellectual tradition that was Judaism's pride. The exuberant emotionalism of Hasidic worship appeared undignified and possibly heretical. The authority granted to tzaddikim seemed to create a new hierarchy that challenged rabbinic leadership. Most troubling of all, given recent history, was the fear that Hasidism might be a revival of Sabbateanism, another movement of popular enthusiasm led by charismatic figures that could end in disaster. The stage was set for one of the most significant conflicts in modern Jewish history, a battle for the soul of Eastern European Jewry that would shape Jewish life for generations to come. The opposition to Hasidism coalesced most powerfully in Lithuania, where the great Talmudic academies had produced generations of brilliant scholars devoted to rigorous textual analysis and legal reasoning. The opponents of Hasidism became known as mitnagdim, meaning opponents or adversaries, and their resistance to the new movement was not merely a matter of personal preference or stylistic difference, but reflected deep convictions about the nature of authentic Judaism and genuine spiritual life. The mitnagdim believed that Torah study was the highest form of worship, that intellectual rigor and legal precision were the marks of true piety, and that emotion without knowledge was dangerous enthusiasm that could easily slide into heresy. They looked at Hasidism and saw ignorance masked as spirituality, dangerous populism undermining traditional authority, and troubling echoes of the Sabbatean disaster that was still within living memory. The towering figure of the Mitnagdic opposition was Elijah ben Solomon Zalman, known as the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna. Born in 1720, the Gaon was a prodigy who by age 20 had mastered not only the entire Talmudic corpus, but also Kabbalah, astronomy, mathematics, and geography. He devoted his life to study, reputedly sleeping no more than 2 hours per night, producing commentaries on virtually every area of Jewish literature, from Bible to Zohar. His intellectual brilliance was universally acknowledged, and his personal piety was beyond question. He lived simply, refused all honors and positions, and devoted himself entirely to the life of the mind and spirit. When such a figure pronounced judgment on Hasidism, people listened. The Vilna Gaon issued bans against the Hasidim, declaring them heretics whose books should be burned, whose prayers should not be counted in a minyan, who should not be married into, whose meat was not kosher. These were severe measures, effectively excommunicating the Hasidim from the Jewish community. The Gaon's specific objections included the Hasidic changes to the liturgy, their adoption of the Sephardic rather than Ashkenazic prayer rite, their boisterous manner of worship, their apparent neglect of Torah study in favor of prayer and storytelling, and their organization around charismatic leaders rather than learned rabbis. But beneath these specific complaints lay deeper concerns about authority, tradition, and the proper relationship between mysticism and halakha. What is particularly interesting is that the Vilna Gaon was himself deeply immersed in Kabbalah. He wrote extensive commentaries on Kabbalistic texts, accepted the reality of the sephirotic system, and believed in the theurgic power of commandments performed with proper mystical intention. His opposition to Hasidism was not opposition to mysticism per se, but to what he saw as its misuse and popularization. For the Gaon, Kabbalah was an elite discipline requiring mastery of the revealed Torah before one could safely approach the hidden dimensions. The Hasidic approach of making mystical concepts accessible to the masses, of emphasizing emotional experience over textual knowledge, struck him as profoundly dangerous. Mysticism needed to be grounded in rigorous halakhic observance and deep Talmudic learning, not floating free as independent spirituality that anyone could claim to possess. The conflict between Hasidim and Mitnagdim was not merely theological but deeply social. In towns where Hasidism became dominant, they would establish their own synagogues, slaughter animals according to their customs, and effectively create a parallel religious infrastructure. This fragmented the Jewish community at a time when unity was already threatened by external pressures from governments and surrounding populations. The Mitnagdim accused Hasidic leaders of enriching themselves through the donations and gifts their followers brought, of living in luxury while ordinary people struggled. They pointed to cases where Hasidic enthusiasm had led to neglect of family obligations, to wasteful spending on pilgrimages to visit tzaddikim when that money was desperately needed at home. The Hasidim, for their part, accused the Mitnagdim of spiritual aridity, of reducing Judaism to intellectual exercise while neglecting the heart and soul, and they argued that not everyone could be a Talmudic scholar, that the traditional system left the majority of Jews feeling excluded and inadequate, that their emphasis on joy and accessibility was bringing Jews back to genuine religious feeling rather than mechanical observance. The mutual recriminations became bitter, with each side convinced that the other represented a fundamental threat to Judaism. In some towns there were physical confrontations, denunciations to government authorities, and lasting communal divisions. Yet over time, the sharp edges of the conflict began to dull. The Hasidim demonstrated that they were not Sabbateans, that they maintained rigorous halakhic observance and did not fall into antinomianism. The second and third generations of Hasidic leaders included serious Talmudic scholars who could hold their own in legal debates. Conversely, the Mitnagdim had to acknowledge that Hasidism was not going away, that it had won the hearts of too many Jews to be suppressed by bans and denunciations. By the early 19th century, while tensions remained, there was increasing recognition that both groups were part of the Orthodox Jewish world, representing different emphases and styles rather than incompatible visions of Judaism. During this period of conflict and accommodation, Kabbalah itself continued to develop in various directions. The Chabad movement, founded by Schneur Zalman of Liadi, represented one significant development, an attempt to synthesize Hasidic devotion with systematic intellectual exposition of mystical concepts. Chabad, an acronym for Chokmah, Binah, Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, the first three sefirot below the crown, emphasized that genuine emotion must be grounded in and generated by intellectual comprehension. Schneur Zalman's Tanya presented a detailed psychology based on Lurianic Kabbalah, explaining the soul's structure, the nature of the struggle between good and evil within the person, and the path to achieving devekut through meditation on divine unity and the illusory nature of material existence. The Tanya taught that every Jew contains two souls, an animal soul derived from the kelipot, the shells or husks of impurity, which seeks physical pleasure and self-aggrandizement, and a divine soul that is literally a part of God above, which desires only to reunite with its source. The spiritual life consists of the divine soul working to refine and redirect the animal soul, using its energies for holy purposes rather than attempting to destroy it. Most people, Schneur Zalman taught, could not achieve complete transformation of the animal soul. That was the level of the tzaddik. But everyone could become a Beinoni, an intermediate person, who maintained constant vigilance to ensure that the animal soul never gained control of thought, speech, or action, even if it still generated unwanted desires and impulses. This teaching was psychologically subtle and offered a realistic spirituality that did not demand superhuman perfection but rather consistent effort and mindfulness. The Tanya became central to Chabad practice, studied repeatedly and meditated upon as a guide to self-understanding and spiritual development. Chabad emphasized that intellectual meditation on divine unity could generate genuine emotional transformation. If one truly contemplated the fact that nothing exists independently of God, that all reality is divine energy taking various forms, that the apparent multiplicity and separateness of things is illusion, this understanding would naturally produce love and awe of God. The emotions would not be artificially worked up, but would emerge organically from clear comprehension of truth. While Chabad represented the intellectual wing of Hasidism, other streams developed different emphases. The Polish and Ukrainian branches became increasingly focused on the personality and power of the tzaddik, with elaborate court culture developing around the major rebbes. Stories about the miraculous abilities of tzaddikim proliferated. They could see into people's souls, know events happening at great distance, heal the sick, bless barren women with children, and secure divine favor for their followers. The relationship between tzaddik and hasid became increasingly hierarchical, with the master serving as absolute spiritual authority and the follower bound in devoted obedience. Critics, both within and outside Hasidism, worried that this created a cult of personality that bordered on idolatry, that it infantilized followers and concentrated too much power in individual leaders. Meanwhile, in non-Hasidic circles, Kabbalah continued to be studied in more traditional frameworks. The Vilna Gaon's approach influenced generations of Lithuanian scholars who saw no contradiction between rigorous Talmudic analysis and deep engagement with mystical literature. They produced commentaries on the Zohar and Lurianic texts that emphasized precision and logical coherence, approaching Kabbalah with the same analytical tools they brought to legal texts. This created a form of mitnagdic mysticism quite different from Hasidic spirituality, intellectual, disciplined, focused on textual mastery rather than ecstatic experience. The 19th century also saw the beginning of academic study of Kabbalah by scholars using modern historical and philological methods. In Western Europe, where Jews were beginning to integrate into broader society and intellectual life, some scholars approached Kabbalah not as sacred revelation, but as historical phenomenon to be analyzed and contextualized. They investigated the origins of Kabbalistic texts, compared them with other mystical traditions, and tried to trace the development of concepts over time. This academic approach was controversial, seen by traditional believers as sacrilege that treated holy wisdom as mere human invention. But it represented an irreversible shift in how Kabbalah was studied, at least in some circles, opening it to historical analysis rather than treating it as timeless tradition. The 19th century also brought new challenges to traditional Jewish life that affected how Kabbalah was received and practiced. The Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, promoted modern education, integration into European society, and reform of traditional practices that seemed backward or superstitious. Kabbalistic teachings about demons, magical practices, and cosmic catastrophe appeared embarrassing to maskilim, enlightened Jews who wanted to present Judaism as rational and modern. Reform Judaism, which emerged in Germany and spread to other Western countries, rejected Kabbalah almost entirely, seeing it as medieval accretion that obscured the ethical monotheism they considered Judaism's essence. Even in Orthodox circles, there was increasing concern about distinguishing authentic Kabbalah from folk superstition and magical practice. At the same time, Kabbalah found new audiences and new forms of expression. Mystical ideas filtered into popular Jewish culture through ethical literature, prayer book commentaries, and sermons that incorporated Kabbalistic concepts without requiring deep study of the original texts. The notion that commandments had cosmic significance, that prayer could affect the divine realm, that there were multiple levels of reality beyond the material, became common assumptions among traditional Jews, even if they never studied Kabbalah formally. In this way, Kabbalistic consciousness permeated Eastern European Jewish life, shaping how people understood their religious practice and their place in the cosmos. The tension between secrecy and accessibility that had characterized Kabbalah from the beginning continued in new forms. Traditional teachers still insisted that mystical study required extensive prerequisites and personal guidance, that texts should not be translated into vernacular languages, that certain teachings should only be shared with qualified students. But books were increasingly available, literacy was spreading, and the mystique of forbidden knowledge made Kabbalah attractive to those who lacked traditional qualifications. This created ongoing debates about who had authority to teach, what could be taught openly and what must remain hidden, and how to maintain authentic transmission in an age of print and mass education. The approach of the 20th century would bring challenges to traditional Jewish life that dwarfed anything faced before: massive migration, world wars, ideological upheavals, and ultimately the Holocaust that would destroy the heartland of European Jewry. Kabbalah would have to adapt to radically new circumstances, finding expression in new centers and new forms. But the foundation had been laid in these centuries of development, conflict, and synthesis. A rich, mystical tradition that had proven its resilience, its ability to speak to fundamental human needs and questions, and its capacity to generate new insights and practices while maintaining connection to ancient sources. The 20th century brought transformations to Jewish life so radical and traumatic that they reshaped every aspect of Jewish culture, practice, and consciousness. The massive migrations from Eastern Europe to America, Argentina, Palestine, and Western Europe at the turn of the century displaced millions of Jews from traditional communities where Kabbalah had been deeply embedded in religious life. The First World War shattered empires and redrew maps, creating new states with uncertain attitudes toward their Jewish minorities. The Russian Revolution brought communism to power in the land where Hasidism and other forms of Jewish mysticism had flourished, initiating decades of religious persecution that sought to eliminate traditional Jewish life entirely. And overshadowing everything else was the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews that destroyed the great centers of European Jewish learning and practice, wiping out entire communities where Kabbalistic traditions had been transmitted for generations. In this context of upheaval and destruction, the academic study of Kabbalah took on new significance through the monumental work of Gershom Scholem. Born in Berlin in 1897 into an assimilated Jewish family, Scholem became fascinated with Jewish mysticism as a young man and devoted his life to recovering and analyzing this tradition using the tools of modern scholarship. He immigrated to Palestine in 1923 and became a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he built the field of Kabbalah studies essentially from scratch. Before Scholem, academic knowledge of Jewish mysticism was fragmentary and often distorted by prejudice. Many scholars dismissed Kabbalah as superstition and obscurantism, an embarrassing aberration from rational Jewish thought. Scholem demonstrated that Kabbalah was a central current in Jewish history, that it had profoundly shaped Jewish life and thought, and that it deserved serious scholarly attention. Scholem's approach was historically rigorous and philologically precise. He examined manuscripts, established chronologies, identified pseudepigraphic attributions, and traced the development of concepts through their various formulations. His major works, including Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Sabbatean Sevi, and extensive studies of Zoharic literature and Lurianic Kabbalah, provided the first comprehensive scholarly account of the mystical tradition. Scholem argued against the prevailing view that Jewish history was primarily the story of rationalism and ethical monotheism, gradually purging itself of mythological and mystical elements. Instead, he showed that mysticism and rationalism had coexisted throughout Jewish history, sometimes in tension, but often in creative dialogue, and that the mystical impulse was as authentically Jewish as the philosophical or legal traditions. One of Scholem's most controversial contributions was his detailed study of Sabbateanism. While traditional Jewish historians had tried to minimize or ignore this embarrassing episode, Scholem demonstrated its centrality to understanding modern Jewish consciousness. He showed that Sabbateanism had affected a huge proportion of world Jewry, that it had continued as an underground movement for generations, and that the need to suppress and forget this trauma had shaped subsequent Jewish thought in ways that operated unconsciously. By bringing Sabbateanism into historical consciousness, Scholem allowed for a more honest and complete understanding of Jewish mystical history, even if his claims about the extent of Sabbatean influence remained debated. Scholem also made important arguments about the nature of mysticism itself and its role in religious traditions. He rejected the idea, common in the study of mysticism, that all mystical experiences were essentially the same, regardless of the religious context in which they occurred. Instead, he insisted that Jewish mysticism was distinctively Jewish, shaped by specifically Jewish concepts, texts, and concerns. The Kabbalists were not seeking some universal mystical experience that transcended Judaism, but were exploring the depths of their own tradition, finding meaning in Torah, commandments, and Jewish history. This made Kabbalah relevant not just to historians of religion, but to anyone interested in understanding Judaism itself. The catastrophe of the Holocaust created both crisis and opportunity for Kabbalah. The destruction of the great European centers of learning meant that many manuscripts were lost, many transmission chains were broken, and the social contexts in which Kabbalistic study had flourished were obliterated. The survivors who reached America or Israel often had to rebuild their lives from nothing, and the preservation of esoteric mystical traditions was not always the first priority. Some Hasidic courts managed to re-establish themselves, with rebbes who had survived or escaped leading remnants of their communities in new lands. But the vibrant world of Eastern European Jewish mysticism, with its multiple competing schools and rich local variations, was gone forever. Yet the Holocaust also generated new spiritual searching. Survivors and subsequent generations grappled with theodicy questions that traditional answers seemed inadequate to address. How could a good and powerful God have permitted such evil? What did it mean to maintain faith after Auschwitz? Some turned to Kabbalistic concepts to make sense of the catastrophe. The Lurianic idea of tzimtzum, of God's withdrawal, creating space for creation, was reinterpreted to speak about divine absence and hiddenness. The breaking of the vessels became a metaphor for historical catastrophe. The work of tikkun, cosmic repair, took on new urgency and poignancy. If the world was shattered, then perhaps the task of the survivors was to gather the fragments and begin the work of restoration, not waiting passively for divine intervention, but actively participating in redemption. In the newly established State of Israel, Kabbalah found new forms and new contexts. The return to the land of Israel, the revival of Hebrew as a living language, and the gathering of Jews from diverse communities created conditions quite different from the European diaspora, where Kabbalah had last flourished. Some saw the establishment of Israel itself as a redemptive event with cosmic significance, a beginning of the messianic process that Kabbalistic tradition had long anticipated. Others developed new syntheses of mystical thought with Zionist ideology, finding in Kabbalah resources for understanding national revival and the relationship between Jews and their land. The relationship between traditional religious communities and secular Zionist culture created interesting dynamics around Kabbalah. In the religiously observant communities, particularly among Hasidim and in certain Sephardic circles, Kabbalah continued to be studied and practiced, much as it had been, with the traditional restrictions and pedagogical structures. But in the broader Israeli culture, there was growing interest in Jewish spirituality that was less bound by orthodox strictures. Academics, artists, and spiritual seekers looked to Kabbalah as a resource for understanding Jewish identity and spirituality in ways that did not require accepting the full framework of halachic observance. This created tension between traditional guardians of Kabbalistic knowledge and those who wanted to access it without the traditional prerequisites. The traditional position held that Kabbalah should only be studied by those who were observant of halakha, knowledgeable in Talmud, married, over 40 years old, and emotionally and intellectually stable. These restrictions were meant to ensure that the powerful ideas and practices of Kabbalah were not misused or misunderstood, but they also excluded the majority of Jews, including many who felt a genuine spiritual hunger and wanted connection to their mystical heritage. The debate about accessibility versus restriction, which had existed in various forms throughout Kabbalistic history, took on new dimensions in the modern context. Some argued that in an age when Jews were increasingly alienated from tradition, when assimilation threatened Jewish continuity, restrictions that kept people away from powerful spiritual resources were counterproductive. Better to share Kabbalah widely and accept that not everyone would understand it perfectly than to guard it so carefully that it became irrelevant to most Jews. Others insisted that lowering the barriers would lead to distortion and superficiality, that Kabbalah divorced from its proper context of halakhic observance and traditional study would become mere New Age spirituality, losing its specifically Jewish character and its depth. During the mid-20th century, several figures worked to make Kabbalah more accessible while maintaining connection to tradition. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz produced translations and commentaries on Kabbalistic texts aimed at educated readers who lacked specialized training. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote popular books explaining Kabbalistic concepts in modern psychological and philosophical language, making meditation techniques accessible to English-speaking audiences. These efforts represented a middle path between complete restriction and wholesale popularization, attempting to maintain authenticity while recognizing contemporary needs and contexts. In America, where large Jewish communities had developed through immigration, Kabbalah took on different forms than in Israel. American Jews were generally more assimilated and less traditionally observant than their European ancestors, but many retained interest in Jewish identity and spirituality. Hasidic communities that had relocated to America, particularly in Brooklyn, maintained traditional approaches to Kabbalistic study within their closed societies. But in the broader American Jewish community, there was growing interest in meditation, personal spirituality, and mystical experience that drew some people toward Kabbalah, even if they had little background in traditional Jewish practice. The 1960s and 1970s brought the counterculture movement, with its interest in Eastern religions, meditation, altered states of consciousness, and alternative spirituality. Some young Jews who had explored Buddhism, Hinduism, or other traditions began to wonder if their own heritage contained comparable spiritual resources. They discovered that Jewish meditation practices had existed, that Kabbalah offered sophisticated cosmologies and psychologies, that mystical experience was part of Jewish history. This led to the Jewish renewal movement and other efforts to recover and adapt traditional mystical practices for contemporary seekers. Teachers like Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Arthur Green, and others worked to create forms of Jewish spirituality that drew on Kabbalistic sources while speaking to modern sensibilities. At the same time, academic study of Kabbalah continued to develop beyond Scholem's foundational work. Scholars trained in his methods produced detailed studies of particular texts, figures, and concepts. They corrected and refined Scholem's arguments, challenged some of his interpretations, and opened new areas of investigation. The field expanded to include feminist analysis of Kabbalistic gender symbolism, psychological interpretation of mystical experiences, comparative studies relating Kabbalah to other mystical traditions, and literary analysis of Kabbalistic texts. Academic conferences, journals, and university programs devoted to Jewish mysticism proliferated, creating an institutional infrastructure for ongoing research. This academic work had ambiguous relationship with traditional religious study of Kabbalah. Traditional practitioners often viewed academic scholarship with suspicion, seeing it as reductionistic and disrespectful, treating sacred wisdom as mere historical artifact. Academics, for their part, sometimes dismissed traditional study as uncritical and obscurantist, failing to recognize historical development and attributing human creations to divine revelation. But there were also productive interactions, with some scholars maintaining personal religious practice while pursuing academic work, and some traditional teachers engaging seriously with scholarly findings. The proliferation of Kabbalistic texts in translation made them available to audiences that would never have accessed them in the original Hebrew and Aramaic. The Zohar, Lurianic texts, Hasidic teachings, and other mystical literature appeared in multiple languages with scholarly introductions and annotations. This democratization of access was unprecedented in Kabbalistic history. What had been guarded secrets available only to elite scholars in closed communities became widely available books that anyone could purchase and read. The implications of this shift are still unfolding, creating both opportunities for spiritual engagement and risks of distortion and superficiality that the traditional restrictions had been designed to prevent. The 20th century had thus transformed Kabbalah from an esoteric tradition, transmitted orally in small circles, to a subject of academic study and popular interest, accessible to unprecedented numbers of people, but also increasingly detached from its original context of practice and transmission. The final decades of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st witnessed an explosion of interest in Kabbalah that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. What had been an esoteric discipline studied by small groups of specialists became a cultural phenomenon discussed in popular media, adapted by celebrities, marketed as self-help spirituality, and incorporated into diverse forms of contemporary Jewish practice. This popularization was both blessing and curse, making mystical concepts accessible to millions while also generating distortions, commercialization, and fierce debates about authenticity and appropriation. The contemporary Kabbalah landscape became extraordinarily diverse, ranging from traditional yeshivot where students pored over Zohar and Etz Hayim in the age-old manner, to university seminars analyzing mystical texts with modern critical tools, to retreat centers offering meditation workshops, to websites and apps promising ancient wisdom for modern lives. The Jewish renewal movement, which emerged from the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, represented one significant stream of contemporary Kabbalistic revival. Led by figures like Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Arthur Waskow, and others, Jewish renewal sought to create forms of Jewish spirituality that honored tradition while embracing contemporary values of egalitarianism, ecological awareness, and personal authenticity. Schachter Shalomi, who had been trained in the Chabad tradition before becoming disillusioned with what he saw as its rigidity and authoritarianism, worked to extract mystical practices from their traditional Orthodox context and make them available to liberal Jews who would never accept halakhic observance as binding. He taught meditation techniques drawn from Kabbalistic sources, adapted Hasidic melodies and storytelling for contemporary communities, and developed what he called paradigm shift theology that reframed traditional concepts in ways he believed were more consonant with modern knowledge and values. Jewish renewal services incorporated extended silent meditation, ecstatic chanting of divine names, dance and movement, and creative liturgy that drew on Kabbalistic symbolism while sometimes radically departing from traditional forms. The movement emphasized spiritual experience over intellectual knowledge, emotional authenticity over doctrinal precision, and inclusivity over boundary maintenance. This made it attractive to Jews who felt alienated from conventional synagogues but wanted connection to their heritage. Critics, both traditional and secular, accused renewal of being superficial, of cherry-picking attractive elements, while ignoring the demanding discipline and comprehensive worldview that gave Kabbalah its coherence and power. But supporters argued that adapting tradition to contemporary needs was exactly what each generation had to do, that frozen orthodoxy led to irrelevance and death. Another significant development was the feminist engagement with Kabbalah. Beginning in the 1970s, feminist scholars and practitioners began examining the elaborate gender symbolism that pervaded Kabbalistic thought, particularly the sexual imagery used to describe relationships between sefirot and the emphasis on the feminine Shekinah as the divine presence in exile. Some feminists found resources in Kabbalah for affirming the feminine aspects of divinity, celebrating the sacred feminine that they felt patriarchal religion had suppressed. The image of the Shekinah, suffering in exile alongside the Jewish people, resonated with women's experiences of marginalization. The goal of mystical practice as facilitating the union of masculine and feminine divine aspects could be read as validating partnership and mutuality. But feminist analysis also revealed deeply problematic aspects of Kabbalistic gender symbolism. The sefirot were arranged hierarchically, with masculine sefirot generally superior to feminine ones. The feminine was often associated with judgment, severity, and potential danger, while masculine sefirot represented mercy and harmony. Sexual imagery in Kabbalistic texts reflected patriarchal assumptions about gender roles and could read as pornographic when subjected to critical feminist analysis. The entire system seemed to encode and sanctify gender essentialism and hierarchy. Feminist Kabbalists worked to recover, reinterpret, or reimagine these symbols in more egalitarian ways. Some emphasized neglected feminine imagery or developed new ritual practices centered on the Shekinah. Others created new Kabbalistic theologies that departed significantly from traditional formulations. Marcia Falk rewrote prayers to eliminate masculine God language and develop new imagery, drawing on biblical and Kabbalistic sources but arranged in non-hierarchical patterns. Lynn Gottlieb and others developed goddess-oriented rituals and ceremonies that claimed roots in ancient Israelite practice recovered through Kabbalistic lens. These creative adaptations generated controversy about whether they represented authentic development of tradition or abandonment of Jewish monotheism. The debates revealed tension between desire to honor tradition and need to address its limitations, between commitment to historically grounded practice and demand for spirituality that spoke to contemporary experience. Perhaps the most controversial development in contemporary Kabbalah was the emergence of popularization efforts that stripped mystical concepts from their traditional religious context and marketed them as universal spiritual wisdom. The most prominent example was the Kabbalah Center, founded by Philip Berg in the 1960s and later led by Berg and his wife Karen. The center offered classes, books, and merchandise promising that Kabbalistic wisdom could solve personal problems, improve relationships, attract prosperity, and provide access to spiritual power. They attracted celebrity followers including Madonna, Demi Moore, and others, generating massive publicity. The center claimed to be democratizing Kabbalah, making it available to anyone regardless of background, religious affiliation, or level of Jewish knowledge. Traditional Jewish religious authorities condemned the Kabbalah Center almost universally. They objected to its commercialization of sacred teachings, its lack of concern for traditional prerequisites and restrictions, its separation of Kabbalah from halachic observance, and its willingness to teach non-Jews and to present Kabbalah as universal wisdom rather than specifically Jewish tradition. The center's marketing materials, promising health, wealth, and happiness through Kabbalistic techniques, seemed to reduce profound spiritual teachings to crude self-help formulas. The sale of red string bracelets, Zohar volumes, treated as talismans regardless of whether purchasers could read them, and Kabbalah water claiming special spiritual properties struck critics as exploitation and superstition. Academic scholars also criticized the center, noting that its teachings often bore little resemblance to historical Kabbalah, that it cherry-picked attractive concepts while ignoring difficult or contextual elements, and that it marketed modern self-help psychology dressed in Kabbalistic vocabulary. Yet the center's success in attracting followers suggested that it was meeting some genuine spiritual needs, that many people were hungry for meaning, transcendence, and connection that mainstream religion and secular culture were not providing. The question was whether the center's version of Kabbalah, however distorted, might serve as gateway leading some people toward deeper engagement with authentic Jewish mysticism, or whether it immunized them against real encounter with tradition by offering counterfeit substitute. Meanwhile, in traditional Orthodox communities, Kabbalah continued to be studied and practiced in ways that would have been recognizable to earlier generations. Hasidic yeshivot taught Tanya and other Hasidic texts. Sephardic study houses explored Zohar and Lurianic writings, and various circles maintained traditional forms of mystical practice, including complex kavanot, midnight vigils, and ritual preparations. These communities generally ignored or deplored popularization efforts, maintaining boundaries and restrictions on who could study what and when. But even within traditional circles, there was more openness to publishing mystical texts, offering classes to broader audiences, and using modern media to spread teachings than would have existed a century earlier. The rise of the internet and digital technology created entirely new ways of accessing Kabbalistic materials. Texts that once required travel to specialized libraries or personal connections to obtain became available through websites and databases. Online classes and video lectures made teachings accessible to people in remote locations or who could not attend physical study sessions. Discussion forums allowed students to connect across geographical boundaries. But digital access also enabled even greater distortion and decontextualization, with websites offering Kabbalistic content ranging from serious scholarship to complete nonsense, with no reliable way for novices to distinguish between them. Another significant contemporary development was the incorporation of Kabbalistic concepts into modern Israeli culture in ways that transcended religious boundaries. Israeli artists, writers, and musicians drew on Kabbalistic imagery and ideas even when personally secular. The poetry of Yehuda Amichai incorporated mystical themes and symbolism. The novels of Amos Oz and others engaged with questions of Jewish identity and destiny that had Kabbalistic dimensions. Popular music featured lyrics drawn from liturgy and mystical texts. This secular engagement with Kabbalah as cultural resource rather than religious practice represented a new phenomenon, creating what some called cultural Kabbalah distinct from both traditional religious study and New Age popularization. The question of who could legitimately access and teach Kabbalah became increasingly fraught. Traditional authorities insisted on maintaining restrictions while acknowledging that enforcement was impossible in an age of mass communication and individualism. Progressive Jews argued that gatekeeping preserved patriarchal and elitist structures, that spiritual wisdom should be freely available to all who sought it. Non-Jews expressed interest in studying Kabbalah, raising questions about whether and how a specifically Jewish tradition could or should be shared with outsiders. Some Kabbalistic teachers developed universal formulations that minimized the Jewish particularism of the tradition, while others insisted that Kabbalah divorced from Jewish practice and community ceased to be Kabbalah at all. Contemporary psychology and neuroscience also engaged with mystical practices drawn from Kabbalistic sources. Researchers studied meditation techniques, investigating their effects on brain function, stress reduction, and psychological well-being. Jewish meditation teachers incorporated findings from these studies, presenting ancient practices as scientifically validated rather than merely traditional. This created productive dialogue between scientific and spiritual frameworks, but also risks of reductionism, treating mystical experience as nothing more than brain chemistry, spiritual practice as merely therapeutic technique. The continuing influence of Gershom Scholem shaped how even traditional practitioners understood their own history. His demonstration that Kabbalah had developed over time, that texts once thought ancient were medieval, that doctrines evolved and changed, made it difficult to maintain simple traditionalist narratives about timeless wisdom transmitted unchanged from Sinai. Even those who rejected historical critical approaches had to reckon with the evidence Scholem and his successors had assembled. This created what some called hermeneutic crisis, fundamental questions about how to read and understand mystical texts once their historical contexts and human authorship were acknowledged. Yet amidst all the controversy and transformation, certain core themes persisted across the diverse contemporary manifestations of Kabbalah. The sense that reality has hidden dimensions beyond surface appearances, that material existence is sustained by spiritual forces, that human actions have cosmic significance, that there is structure and meaning in what appears as chaos, that the world, despite its brokenness, can be repaired, that divinity can be encountered directly rather than only through institutional mediation. These Kabbalistic insights continue to resonate with people across religious and cultural boundaries. Whether accessed through traditional yeshiva study, academic scholarship, meditation retreats, artistic expression, or popular books, Kabbalah offered ways of understanding existence that many found compelling, that gave life depth and purpose, that opened possibilities for meaning and transcendence in an increasingly secular and disenchanted world. The question facing contemporary Kabbalah was whether it could maintain authenticity and depth while adapting to radically new contexts, whether the tradition's essence could survive the transformations necessary for its transmission into an uncertain future. As Kabbalah moves further into the 21st century, it occupies a complex and multifaceted place in Jewish life and in the broader spiritual landscape of contemporary culture. the tradition that began with ancient mystics seeking visions of the divine chariot, that flowered in medieval Spain with elaborate theologies of divine emanation, that was revolutionized in 16th century Safed with doctrines of cosmic catastrophe and repair, that inspired mass movements of devotional piety and messianic fervor, that survived persecution and catastrophe, that weathered the challenges of modernity and secularization, now exists in forms that would astonish its earlier practitioners while retaining threads of continuity that connect contemporary seekers to their ancient predecessors. In traditional Orthodox communities, particularly among Hasidim and in certain Sephardic circles, Kabbalah continues to be studied and practiced much as it has been for generations. Young men sit in dimly lit study halls, poring over the Zohar and its commentaries, wrestling with the intricacies of the sephirotic system, learning the complex kavanot that should accompany prayer and ritual performance. Rebbes offer teachings to their followers, explicating mystical concepts and telling stories of earlier tzaddikim whose lives embodied the ideals the teachings describe. Midnight vigils mark the exile of the Shekinah, special ceremonies welcome Sabbath as divine bride, pilgrimages to the graves of mystics and wonder-workers seek blessing and inspiration. In these communities, Kabbalah is not separate esoteric discipline, but thoroughly integrated into the fabric of daily religious life, shaping how people pray, how they understand the commandments, how they make sense of suffering and celebrate joy. Yet even within traditional circles there have been subtle shifts responding to contemporary circumstances. The insularity that characterized many Orthodox communities in earlier generations has become harder to maintain in an age of mass communication and global connectivity. Young people have access to information and perspectives that previous generations never encountered. Some traditional authorities have responded by being more explicit about why certain restrictions exist, by offering more systematic instruction rather than assuming knowledge would be absorbed through immersion in community life, by publishing texts and teaching materials that were once transmitted only orally. This greater openness represents adaptation to changed circumstances while trying to preserve essential boundaries and structures. The academic study of Kabbalah has matured into a sophisticated field with multiple competing methodologies and approaches. Beyond the historical philological work pioneered by Scholem, scholars now employ literary theory, feminist analysis, cognitive science, comparative mysticism, and other frameworks to understand Kabbalistic texts and practices. Major research universities around the world offer courses and programs in Jewish mysticism. International conferences bring together scholars to share research and debate interpretations. The field has produced critical editions of important texts, detailed studies of particular concepts and figures, and synthetic works that trace developments across centuries and regions. This scholarly work serves multiple functions, preserving texts and knowledge that might otherwise be lost, making materials accessible to those outside traditional transmission chains, and generating new understandings that can enrich both academic and religious engagement with the tradition. Yet the relationship between academic study and religious practice remains complicated. Some scholars maintain personal religious commitments while pursuing historical research, finding ways to honor both critical inquiry and faith. Others adopt purely secular approaches, treating Kabbalah as cultural artifact without investment in its truth claims. Traditional practitioners sometimes view academic work with suspicion or hostility, seeing it as reductionistic dissection that kills what it claims to study. But there are also productive exchanges with traditional teachers, sometimes drawing on scholarly findings, and academics showing respect for living traditions. The tension between insider and outsider perspectives, between faith and critical distance, between commitment and objectivity, continues to generate both friction and creativity. In the liberal and progressive Jewish world, Kabbalah has become a significant resource for spiritual renewal and innovation. Rabbis and educators who serve Reform, conservative and Reconstructionist communities increasingly incorporate mystical concepts and practices into their teaching and liturgy. Meditation retreats, wilderness experiences, and contemplative prayer services draw on Kabbalistic sources adapted for contemporary liberal sensibilities. The emphasis on personal spiritual experience, on divine immanence, on the mystical dimensions of Torah and ritual offers resources for Jews seeking depth and transcendence within a liberal framework that values autonomy and critical thinking. Teachers like Arthur Green, Eben Leder, and others have developed sophisticated theologies that draw deeply on Kabbalistic tradition while engaging honestly with modern knowledge and values. This liberal appropriation of Kabbalah has generated its own controversies and challenges. Some question whether Kabbalah can maintain its integrity when separated from halachic observance and traditional community structures. The elaborate sefirotic system was developed within a context of strict religious practice and embedded in assumptions about gender, authority, and cosmic order that many liberals reject. Can you extract the poetry and insight while discarding the metaphysical assumptions and social structures? Does Kabbalah become something fundamentally different, perhaps not really Kabbalah anymore, when transplanted into liberal soil? Or is this creative adaptation exactly what keeps tradition alive and relevant? What prevents it from becoming museum piece or fossil? The creative arts have proven to be particularly fertile ground for Kabbalistic influence in contemporary culture. Writers, visual artists, musicians, and filmmakers have drawn on mystical imagery, concepts, and narratives to create works that resonate with audiences far beyond those who study Kabbalah formally. The novelist Nicole Krauss explores themes of language, absence, and hidden connections that echo Kabbalistic concerns. Artists like Anselm Kiefer have created powerful visual meditations on mystical texts and themes. Musicians, from traditional cantors to experimental composers to popular performers, incorporate Kabbalistic elements into their work. Film and television have featured Kabbalistic symbols and storylines, sometimes with more accuracy than others. This cultural diffusion means that Kabbalistic concepts and imagery circulate in public consciousness, even among people who have never studied a mystical text. The question of authenticity haunts these contemporary engagements with Kabbalah. Who decides what counts as authentic Kabbalah versus distortion or appropriation? Traditional authorities claim that right, insisting on particular prerequisites, practices, and frameworks, but their authority is not universally recognized, and many who engage with Kabbalistic materials reject the premise that gatekeepers should control access to spiritual wisdom. Academic scholars can identify historical Kabbalah and distinguish it from modern inventions, but historical accuracy is not the only relevant standard. Something can be innovation rather than faithful transmission, yet still have spiritual value and legitimate connection to tradition. The vitality of living traditions depends on their ability to adapt and respond to new circumstances, but adaptation can shade into distortion and eventually into something so different that calling it by the original name becomes misleading. The global nature of contemporary culture means that Kabbalah now circulates far beyond Jewish communities. Non-Jews study Kabbalistic texts, practice meditation techniques derived from mystical sources, and incorporate Kabbalistic concepts into their spiritual frameworks. Some Kabbalistic teachers actively welcome non-Jewish students, seeing the tradition as containing universal wisdom meant for all humanity. Others insist that Kabbalah is inseparable from Jewish practice and identity, that teaching it to non-Jews is both inappropriate and ultimately futile, since the concepts only make sense within their original context. This disagreement reflects deeper questions about particularism and universalism, about whether religious traditions have fixed boundaries or permeable membranes, about the ethics of cultural exchange versus appropriation. Looking toward the future, several trajectories seem likely to continue shaping how Kabbalah develops and is transmitted. Technology will play an increasingly important role, with digital archives making texts accessible, online learning platforms offering courses and tutorials, social media, creating communities of interest and practice, that transcend geography. Artificial intelligence might eventually offer sophisticated tools for analyzing Kabbalistic texts, finding patterns and connections that human readers miss, though whether such analysis would generate genuine insight or merely interesting data remains to be seen. Virtual reality could potentially create immersive experiences of mystical visualizations and journeys, though the relationship between technological simulation and authentic spiritual experience is unclear. The ongoing dialogue between science and spirituality will likely continue to influence how people understand and practice Kabbalah. Quantum physics, with its paradoxes and non-intuitive behaviors, seems to some people to parallel mystical claims about the nature of reality. Neuroscience investigations of meditation and altered states of consciousness provide empirical data about practices that mystics have engaged in for millennia. While some practitioners embrace these scientific perspectives as validation, others worry about reductionism and the flattening of spiritual experience into mere brain chemistry. Finding frameworks that honor both scientific rigor and spiritual meaning without collapsing one into the other remains an ongoing challenge. The environmental crisis that threatens planetary survival has led some contemporary teachers to mine Kabbalistic sources for ecological wisdom. The doctrine of divine sparks trapped in material existence and requiring liberation can be read as teaching reverence for the natural world. The emphasis on interconnection and the cosmic consequences of human action suggests environmental consciousness. The brokenness of the world and the call to tikkun, repair, speak powerfully to contemporary needs to heal damaged ecosystems and restore balance. Whether these ecological readings are faithful to historical Kabbalah or creative reinterpretations serving present needs, they demonstrate the tradition's capacity to speak to urgent contemporary concerns. The persistence of Kabbalah across centuries, its survival through catastrophe and radical change, suggests that it addresses something fundamental in human experience: the hunger for meaning, for connection to something greater than the self, for understanding of why things are as they are, for agency in repairing what is broken, for encounter with mystery and transcendence. These are not specifically medieval or Jewish concerns, but enduring human needs. Kabbalah offers one sophisticated, psychologically rich, and spiritually profound way of addressing these needs. It provides vocabularies for discussing experiences that resist prosaic description, frameworks for making sense of suffering and celebrating joy, practices for cultivating awareness and transformation. At the same time, Kabbalah carries the marks of its specific origins and developments. It emerged from and spoke to Jewish experience of exile, persecution, and longing for redemption. Its symbols and structures reflect particular historical moments and cultural contexts. Its texts were written in specific languages with untranslatable nuances. The question is whether these particular origins limit Kabbalah to relevance only for Jews steeped in traditional practice, or whether the particular can speak to the universal, whether wisdom developed in one context can illuminate others. The evidence suggests both are true. Kabbalah is most coherent and powerful within its original framework of Jewish belief and practice, yet elements of it resonate with and can enrich the lives of those far from that framework. The balance between preserving tradition and enabling innovation, between maintaining boundaries and allowing access, between honoring the past and addressing the present, remains perpetually in negotiation. Each generation must decide how to receive what it has inherited and what to pass on to the next generation. The choices made today about how Kabbalah is taught, practiced, adapted, and transmitted will shape what the tradition becomes tomorrow. There is no neutral position, no way to freeze things as they are. Even choosing to maintain traditional restrictions represents an active decision with consequences, just as does opening access more widely. What seems certain is that Kabbalah will continue to evolve and develop as long as there are people seeking the kinds of meaning and experience it offers. The specific forms may change dramatically. may become unrecognizable to earlier generations, may fragment into diverse streams with little in common beyond name and distant ancestry. Or perhaps there will be ongoing conversation between different approaches, mutual critique and enrichment, with traditionalists, academics, and innovators all contributing to living tradition. The mystical impulse that drove ancient sages to seek visions beyond the veil, that inspired medieval scholars to map the divine structure, that moved safed mystics to weep at midnight for the exiled Shekinah, that animated Hasidic masters to find God in every moment, that sustained Jews through catastrophe with hope of cosmic repair. That impulse persists, taking new forms but connecting contemporary seekers to an ancient lineage of those who insisted that the surface of things conceals depths worth exploring, that the world we see is not all there is, that human beings can participate in processes larger and more significant than their individual lives, that brokenness can be repaired and meaning can be found even in the darkest circumstances. This is the living legacy of Kabbalah, and it continues to unfold in ways both faithful to its past and responsive to its future.